Hello everyone. I'm glad to see you on my channel. The story I'm going to tell you today is pure. It is true that all the bad things that happen in life happen for a reason. It is said that we can appreciate the good things, the things when they happen to us. I hope you enjoy this story. I wish you a pleasant viewing experience. Until that night, when the red moon rose, Harvey in his life regretted only one thing that gave his young years to the bustling, noisy, and empty. In fact, city life. He was born in a small town, and not just small in population, and quite tiny where all the streets are walked and walked over by the time you became a first grader, where one movie theater, and instead of a fashionable sparkling glass shopping center, modest indoor market, where, however, the locals could find everything they needed, from potatoes in bulk to inexpensive, sturdy clothes made in China. And of course, there was not a lot of work here. One enterprise, a factory, once fed the men, but in the 90s, when it was taken over by private hands, everyone had to relearn that from here. They came home not with a fat paycheck, from which the wife blossoms and the children jump to the ceiling, but with a fat salary, which would buy bread until the end of the month, and that's happiness. Then, however, the situation improved a little. But the residue, as they say, remained. Harvey's father was a hard worker, but unlike many of his friends, he couldn't stand the big changes of the new times and got drunk. "You got to go away," said Harvey's father, pounding his fist on the table. "Study, Harvey, or I'll go to my grave. What will you be, a janitor?" In general, Harvey had nothing against being a janitor. Such a man lived and worked in the house called Mike, and was a quiet, kind, cheerful man. Yes, poor as a mouse, but through his labors the yard, where the kids played, was always clean, and in winter Mike the Fool, as he was affectionately called, built such ice slides and snow figures molded that people came from all over the city to look at them. So Harvey was ashamed of his father for speaking so contemptuously, and he dodged his educational monologues as best he could. But his mother apparently listened, and to the max, because one day she filed for divorce. And one day Harvey's mother, which had never happened to her before, began to carry bottles to him. She carried, and then slipped papers to sign, and got permission to take Harvey far away, beyond the sea, ocean, and even in Europe. The thing was that Harvey's mother was a beautiful woman, and also a cook with experience in general, was an enviable bride in any geographical point of the world. And there was an American man from Kansas. He was a widower, and like many at the time, was fond of the theme of brides by correspondence. And here he was not embarrassed by the child at the chosen one. John decided that the working hands will be on the farm. In general, Harvey's mother gathered her son in a bag and flew away. Harvey's opinion, of course, was not asked. And when he ravapoppled that nowhere to fly, his mother just gave him a backhand and offered an alternative orphanage. She, of course, only intimidated, but how 10-year-old Kolka knew it, and American life began for the boy. True, he never realized what this American dream tasted like. There was plenty of work on the farm. One cornfield was worth it. Plus, there were also pigs, chickens. Meat was labeled organic, and as John said, sold for much more than what was supplied to the market corporations. And so, in small things was still for his family vegetable garden and a small orchard. Over time, Harvey, of course, got used to. And what else was he, in fact, to do? Only to get used to it. He tried to get along with the kids at school. By the way, he was not the only foreigner there. There were plenty of immigrants from Mexico. Then, when he graduated from high school, went to college, but taken a loan, because the money for this John did not find it necessary to put aside. In general, Harvey's soul did not lie to the legal sciences. But his mother, all ears, buzzed to say that her son will be successful. Even on Wall Street in New York will work. Harvey studied at the first-year inertia, following the dream that his mother invented for him, and then expelled. The dean, surprisingly enough, reacted 100 times more loyally than his parents, and even wished him good luck because, As he said, every person in life has his calling, and finding it is much more important than following something that is not yours at all. Harvey, having packed his belongings, only one by the way, bag was enough, hitchhiked across the states. He stopped here and there, interrupted by casual earnings, and just thought what he should do next in this life. There was no one left in his hometown. His father died of white fever. His grandparents died long ago. Harvey suddenly realized how calm and peaceful it was when he looked at the forest. The majestic sea of pine tops floated below, under the serpentine mountain road on which the truck was driving. A ghostly sea of fog drifted by. The rays of the rising sun seemed to be woven of pure gold. Such beauty made his chest ache. In the town where he was dropped off, Harvey asked the locals if there was any work in the forest. At first they looked a little surprised and scented most of the sawmill. But then one grandfather from the gas station said that the forest here considered ordinary, but it borders further with the national park and therefore need people. But immediately in the foresters, of course, Harvey was not taken. No one had to get the appropriate training and experience. But then, how it felt better. And although almost 20 years since that memorable morning when he fell in love with the forest flew by, but still Harvey has every time sweetly in his heart when he went out for the first time in a day on familiar paths and walked leisurely. The car, of course, was also everything as it should be, but he did not like to use it. Well, why in the forest all this civilization? When you have hands and feet, you know yourself, look after the forest property. It was looking, by the way, well. Tourists sometimes wandered in, but those mostly reached the Capmings and did not create any problems. Locals also walked, but so along the edge of the forest, for mushrooms or berries. But what Harvey never came across here was poachers. And he was very happy about it because he loved all kinds of animals, even sometimes more than people. That evening, Harvey was sitting on the bank of the forest stream, sipping black sweet coffee from a thermos and looking at the moon. In general, of course, he could have found a better place to admire the lunar eclipse and also to bring binoculars. But he didn't want to make a fuss, and so this cosmic phenomenon was impressive. The moon seemed to become lower, closer and poured as if with rowan juice, turned scarlet amber. Harvey clucked his tongue at the phenomena in the world. No Hollywood special effects are capable of such a thing. In general, usually he used to go back to his gatehouse earlier, but today he was late. Because he had to calm down old Billy, who lived at the edge of the forest with a sheepdog named Barry and had long since retired. But he still made a lot of noise. Billy had once been a journalist in Washington, but then he quit, or rather was kicked out, because Billy became obscenely interested in urban legends about ghosts and werewolves and tried to sneak the whole thing into the paper. But Bill was accepted into the newspaper, maybe because he had been in a prestigious position before, and also because the locals sometimes didn't mind reading such tales. Even a whole page in the newspaper was devoted to mystical cases. Anyway, Billy worked here until his retirement, and he couldn't calm down. In the last few months, he'd been saying there were werewolves roaming the woods. He'd seen them with his own eyes. Naturally, nobody believed Billy. And Harvey felt sorry for the old man. He suspected that whiskey and loneliness were to blame. But when Billy began to say that if they didn't protect him from werewolves, he would write to the FBI, the mayor said, "Don't embarrass us, old man, please." So Harvey had Harvey go through the woods, look for signs of wolves, and calm Bill down. "There aren't even ordinary wolves around here," Harvey reported to the experienced journalist. And for some reason he felt like a boy who didn't understand the obvious and was shamed by the adults for it. Billy snorted, spat through a gap in his teeth, shook his fist at the forest, and told Harvey that he was deluded and influenced by those who didn't want the truth about werewolves exposed. Harvey scratched in the back of his head and then waved his hand and walked away. He felt sorry for Bill, but he was crazy. After thinking of Bill, Harvey got up, put the thermos with the rest of the coffee in his backpack, stopped at the convenience store, on the way to stock up on some groceries and walk down the familiar path. There's going to be a storm, Harvey thought, as he watched the sky rapidly darken with cold, black clouds. And here, the first drops began to drip. And in this rapidly thickening gloom, as if someone had tipped a can of ink on the world, Harvey suddenly noticed the smell. Anyone, but any experienced forester, has a flair for certain odors, no worse than a wild beast. Harvey realized it smelled like a campfire. It was strictly forbidden to build fires in the part of the forest where he was staying. The weather was such that one spark would be enough to start a disaster that would require firefighting helicopters from all over the country. Harvey rushed through the forest and flew into a clearing. It was a small clearing in the thicket, as if there was a pocket in the forest. And the first thing that the forester noticed was the fireplace still warm. The smoke was rising faintly. It was clear that it had been hastily covered with earth. And the second thing he noticed was a girl. A very young girl in a black tattered dress and torn black tights, black boots, black hair. When he came closer, he noticed black lipstick on her lips and a black leather collar with spikes like a dog's around her neck. Only the rebellious, obviously gothic look of the girl Harvey was much less embarrassed that he still realized from her she was either drunk or had taken something. "Hey," Harvey said and gently touched her bare shoulder. The girl groaned, squeaked and shook her head, flailed her arms as if she were trying to fly off the ground. Harvey cursed softly. What a problem. He squatted down and patted her cheeks. "Hey, you all right? What hurts?" Harvey had never served in the police force and had never encountered any dark cases in his life. But he realized at once that something bad had happened to this girl. First of all, there were footprints everywhere, and those who had been here and made a fire had run away and left her behind. Secondly, there were bruises on the girl's neck, shoulders, arms, and even legs. There were no other visible injuries, but Harvey swallowed hard, thinking what could have happened to a young girl who was not responsible for her actions and was in bad company. And what to do now? Harvey swore quietly again. The car, as it turned out, was under repair, and meanwhile the weather was getting worse. He took out his phone and spat. Well, of course there was no connection. And he knew already now, when the storm was raging, no matter how many times he ran around the neighborhood with his phone, he would not get a signal. So at 911, one cannot call. Walk. And the girl, by the way, mumbles something as if in a delirium and will not move on her own. Harvey estimated thin, but in the woods will not carry. And then the icy rain will pour. The girl will freeze to death. Harvey remembered the weather forecast, and the local forecasters were clairvoyants, for they were always accurate. And they promised that by early morning the storm would pass. So, in a few hours it would be possible to take the girl to town. But even better, of course, call someone to the place, let them and the doctors immediately get to his bare corner, and then take care of this strange foundling. And for now, having conveniently thrown his backpack behind his back, Harvey picked up the girl in his arms as if she were a bride. "Shh! Don't be afraid. I'm saving her," he mumbled as she opened her eyes for a moment. And it just so happened that at that moment a bolt of lightning tore through the sky and lit up her face. Harvey realized that the girl's eyes were blue, light as spring ice. But in a moment they were hidden again behind heavy, black, plastered eyelids. From the clearing to the gatehouse he reached quickly with his burden, and as soon as he stepped over the threshold, a wall of rain covered everything like a bucket of water, which poured downwards and then almost horizontally. So strong was the roaring wind. Having laid the girl on a narrow bunk, the only one, by the way, Harvey covered her with a blanket, and himself hastily built a fire in a small stove and put tea. He rushed to the first aid kit. He himself was not usually ill, but he found something for painkillers, for fever. The girl screamed and jumped up, sitting on the bed. Harvey almost scalded himself with the tea he was pouring into the mug. "Quiet. It's all right. I'm a woodsman. I won't hurt you. I've saved you, he ranted and raised both hands for good measure. Where? Where are they? The girl was shaking as if she were being yanked with all her might. No one is here, Harvey ventured. Stepped closer and put a mug in her hand. Drink. It's tea. Your body temperature is low, he added. I found you in the clearing. There was no one else there. The girl gave him a suspicious glance and sniffed, but immediately turned her attention to the tea. Harvey sat down on a stool farther away. A few minutes passed in awkward silence. I'm a forester, he repeated. My name is Harvey. Mallory, replied the girl. Mallory, I'll call the police rescue, but there's no communication right now. We can't go through the forest in such a storm. We can't go down the mountain, you know. Harvey swallowed hard. Oh, what a story. Those who were there, they'll be found, he said, and stared at his hands. He didn't want to ask her what had happened. He was ashamed to talk about such things. But he wasn't sure that he'd gotten it right either. It was just, what else would he think if he found a girl in the woods, almost undressed, with bruises all over her body? Anyway, Harvey sighed. I didn't mean to, sobbed Mallory, and pulled her knees up, wrapped her arms around them, dropped her face down, and howled softly. They promised they'd help me. That I would be saved. That life would get better. I didn't want to. I didn't know this would happen. Suddenly, outside the gatehouse, there was a rumbling, scraping sound, and Mallory, shrieking, flung herself against the wall so hard that she hit the back of her head. It's them. Who? Harvey frowned. It's the storm. They've come for me. They're here. The girl's eyes widened with terror. She was trembling again. They'll take me. No. Please, don't give me to them. There's no one there. Harvey jumped up, but he felt a twinge in his stomach, and Mallory was very much afraid. What sort of scum had met her? I'll be right back, Harvey said, and went to the door. I tell you, it's a storm. A branch must have come off and fallen on the roof. No, they'll kill you. It's all right, there's no one there, Harvey said, and walked resolutely out of the gatehouse. It's dark. It's raining. The light of the flashlight did not seem to improve visibility, but only made it worse. As forest shadows were distorted, familiar objects took on indistinct shapes. But Harvey resolutely went around the gatehouse. No one. He came back. Empty, he said. That's what, Mallory. Come on, get some sleep. The storm will soon pass, and I'll sit here. He showed her the phone, and as soon as there is a signal, I'll call for help. I'm scared, Mallory said, and then, still sniffling, crawled under the blanket and turned her back to the wall. Harvey shook his head pityingly at the girl. Perhaps she herself, of course, had gone with bad company, but it wasn't her fault anyway. There was nothing to blame her for. Except for being too gullible, Harvey picked up a paperback detective book. The light of the battery-powered lamp used to soothe him, set him in a special mood of peace. Yes, the stove was still playing, jumping tongues of flame, but now all this warmth and light were somehow violently opposed to what ruled outside the walls of the gatehouse storm, darkness, deserted forest. In general, before such things never frightened Harvey, because if on the past it is all natural world, this human civilization as it is not quite natural for the world, if we take the scale of the whole history. But today it seemed to Harvey in that he is a small and stupid, helpless little man who dared to take away from the wild forest victim. Harvey jerked and jumped up. It turned out that he had dozed off. He went to the wash basin and splashed cold water on his face. But it didn't get any easier, and Harvey decided that he should lie down and take a nap. After all, in the morning he would call the rescuers. They would take Mallory away, and he would stay as before. He would have to fulfill his duties as a forest ranger, and how to do it if you're down on your feet. So Harvey got up and took out a spare blanket in the closet, took a warm jacket, rolled it up like a pillow, and made a place for himself on the floor because the only bed was occupied by the girl. He lay down, promising himself it would only take half an hour. During the years of forest, secluded for the most part life in the city, Harvey tried to spend a minimum of time. He learned to wake up when necessary, approximately without an alarm clock. Waking up was strange. Harvey was enveloped by a soft warmth. It seemed to flow over the body in waves, rising from the hips to the chest and then smoothly descending down. He was unexpectedly hot and breathing faster, but he could not remember. And what was so good? Pleasant, he dreamed. But how pleasant it was now. Harvey opened his eyes. "What are you doing?" he shouted, jumping up and shoving Mallory away from him. Her dress had slipped off her shoulders, exposing the straps of her bra. Her skirt was pulled up. The girl's cheeks were flushed, her eyes glistening feverishly. She was looking at Harvey strangely, gazing eagerly. Her mouth was open. Her breathing was rapid. "Are you crazy?" He continued his indignation and rose to his feet. "Don't you like me?" she asked in a whisper, and reached for him as if it were not a gesture of lust, but a longing to reach him, to save him, to enclose him in an embrace that would protect him from harm. Harvey rubbed his face with the palms of his hands. What a waking experience. As if he didn't have enough trouble. "You can't do that, but I just want to be grateful," almost purred Mallory. And then you're the victim." "I don't know. I'm sorry. The details, but you, he waved his hands vaguely, gesturing as if to say that the subject was extremely heavy and uncomfortable for him. "You don't know what you're doing. You're drunk, I guess." "Whoa." Harvey rushed to the only window. It was dark, but it was no longer stormy. "I'm sorry." Mallory lowered her eyes and finally fixed her dress. I just don't have much time. And I wanted to thank you, and, well, what do you mean you don't have a lot of time? Harvey picked up the phone to check the connection. "I'm gonna die soon," she answered, as casually as if she were telling him what time she had to go to work tomorrow. Harvey stared at her like she was crazy. "So I've decided. I want to thank you, and I don't want to." Mallory shrank into a lump, looking like a battered, hunted animal. "I don't want to die a virgin." "Oh, for crying out loud!" Harvey's eyes widened. "Are you out of your mind? You're not going to die. There's a connection. I'm calling 911. I want them to find out who hurt you and who started a fire in my woods. That's not allowed. And you're not gonna die. What's wrong with you? You're young." Harvey tried to send a reassuring smile to the girl. "Pretty. You'll live and live." "Thank you," said Mallory, "but he chose me. He's coming for me." "Who is?" She met his gaze, and then she said a word. It was familiar to Harvey. He'd heard it a couple of times from the locals. It meant a wolf shifter, or rather an evil sorcerer who could shed his skin and put on another, turning into an animal of prey. "A shifter," Mallory said. "He chose me." "Poor thing," Harvey said heartily, because he didn't doubt that the girl had lost her mind. "But don't worry. No werewolf will get you." "Promise?" Mallory sniffed and looked at him so pleadingly, so hopefully, that it made his heart ache to feel sorry for her, as if she were, say, a little sister. "I promise," Harvey said. And the next moment he was connected to the emergency operator, and further events merged into a motley, noisy kaleidoscope of rescuers, doctors, and cops arrived. They examined the clearing, questioned 100 times about the same thing. Mallory was put in the car and taken away. Harvey would have been glad to stay just for that day. He had planned to check the old feeders from which all sorts of forest animals were fed. But it didn't work out. He stayed in town. Harvey was modestly glad that the sheriff wasn't one of the red tape types, but he was his own man. And Jacob and he had known each other for 10 years. "Lucky you found the girl," Jacob said when the formalities were over. "And lucky you did," he added. And with a chuckle he tweaked his fingers into a mustache worthy of the chief law. "And Orderman in a Western. What do you mean? Harvey inquired. We have peaceful animals here. Wolves have never been seen. Wolverines. They are in principle, as I have already said, not dangerous if... I'm not talking about animals, Jacob said. I'm just talking about the ones that didn't come back. Harvey said. He was getting very uncomfortable again, poor thing. Well, I shouldn't tell you this, but you're really worried, Jacob said. Well, there was no sexual assault. But she was pretty banged up, bruised, sprained. That's good, that's lucky, Harvey nodded, so she'll recover quickly. And about those scumbags? Do you think any of the locals would do such a thing? We have different people, but we've been living peacefully. How long now, haven't we? I'm afraid she won't recover quickly, Jacob said. Mallory said such things. Then she tried to run right out of the hospital, thinking one of the nurses was a werewolf. She said he had horns, fangs, and claws, so they'd put her in a clinic for the mentally ill. And as for the local versions, the sheriff lowered his voice in confidence. It's not definite yet. But it seems to be a serious matter. Something similar has been done before. Far from us, but it's only in a neighboring state. And there, well, it was worse there. What do you mean? Harvey asked. Sacrifice, Jacob shuddered. Human sacrifice. We'll work now, but I'm afraid the feds are going to show up soon and take everything away from us. And then, of course, we'll be on the sidelines of the whole affair. Harvey shook his head. He had once chosen his place of residence to live in peace and quiet, to live without the hustle and bustle of big cities. But of course he shouldn't have been naive because madmen and maniacs are all over the earth. Jacob continued to talk. He said he thought he would warn the locals to be careful, but he wouldn't give out all the information so as not to cause panic. He also asked Harvey to be careful because, after all, he was always in his own woods. Leaving the sheriff's office, Harvey decided to stop by his city dwelling, namely a small apartment, the meter of which made it look like a single room, but thoughtful layout and furnishings allowed to include everything necessary for the unpretentious man to live. He threw a stack of letters on the table later. Even today you can make out. But then one letter caught his eye. It had a lot of stamps on it. Harvey picked it up, ran his eyes over the address. It was from Archie. Not all ties with his hometown were lost and broken. Not all of them. There was one distant seventh water on the vine, which at some point appealed to Harvey with a serious request if you would help, say, relative to get a job in America to his fellow countrymen and our son Archie, a guy who wants to study in the U.S. and work. Harvey answered honestly that he would be glad to help, but he didn't know how, unless this Archie was going to become a forester. It turned out that Archie's ambition was not to become a forester, but a lawyer or a manager who wanted to work with money on Wall Street. Then Harvey thought it even funny. That's how life turns out in different people. He had all this career in his time for nothing, and someone for the sake of it, as they say, ready for anything. In the end, he and this Archie talked a little in correspondence. In chat, Harvey told him all sorts of useful little things about how to save money on products here. What insurance is better to buy. Then the guy called him a couple of times and thanked him for his support, and then there was no connection for a long time, but Harvey remembered that Archie should have graduated from university by now. He opened the letter and found out that Archie not only graduated, but also got a job offer. Not in the heart of the city where the big money is, of course, but a decent one. But there was still time left before it started, and he decided to take a scenic drive to see, so to speak, the real America, and he was just asking if it was possible to visit Harvey for a week. Harvey, in fact, though he had never seen this guy, but decided that why not. He smiled, and he was old-fashioned Archie, because he'd sent a paper letter and an electronic copy. Only Harvey had missed the email for some reason, and hadn't noticed it in his inbox. But right now, digging through his phone, he found it and did not hesitate to write a reply to say, "Come, I'm waiting for you. I will accept you as a native, and do not even worry about housing, because you can, instead of a hotel, to stay in my apartment, because I myself say still like an owl in the wood sitting." After he had sent the message, his soul brightened up, whether because of the past gloomy events or just because of the mood. But Harvey suddenly realized how much he lacked communication with other people, and who could be a more suitable candidate for this than a relative, albeit a distant one. Harvey took a critical look around the apartment, and it would be better to clean up a little and throw all the bedding in the laundry, because it is really uncomfortable to receive relatives as in a pigsty. And Harvey decided to spend the night here. In general, he explained it to himself by the fact that in the morning there were still some things to do, and there was nothing to waste hours on the way to the hut, his guardhouse, just to fall asleep, and early in the morning to stomp back. But in fact and deep down, Harvey was just afraid to admit to himself that he was uncomfortable to spend the night in the forest alone after everything that had happened. Stupid, yes. Very silly for an old-time forester and a materialist. Yes, except that Harvey did not consider himself 100% materialist, and he admitted that something like that existed in the world. But he could not really admit that when he was carrying Mallory through the forest, he felt that strange feeling when the hairs on the back of his neck stood up, because it seemed that someone evil and powerful was watching you piercingly. Harvey shook off that feeling as best he could, as if it were liquid mud. It was embarrassing for a grown man. But right today, here and now, he decided that he would lose a little of this battle with his own nerves and stay the night in the apartment. The next morning, Harvey had breakfast at the diner Coyote and Cactus. In general, in their latitudes, neither of them, but the name of the diner was given by a Mexican immigrant, Carlos, and since then it somehow took root. The place was a favorite of the locals and served in particular excellent coffee, as well as blueberry pancakes and Carlos's special omelet with a double portion of bacon, cheese, and cauliflower. All the tables were occupied, so Harvey was confused at first, but then he noticed that Bill was waving at him from one place. Greeting his neighbor, Harvey accepted the invitation to have breakfast together. They exchanged some meaningless phrases, and then Bill, in a confidential whisper, asked how it was, all that had happened. "Nothing. We'll get over it," Harvey replied. "Poor Mallory," sighed Bill. "She was already alone, and now they've locked her up in the nut house. What kind of a mad woman is she? Just a lost soul. Doesn't she have any family?" "Do you know her?" Harvey asked. According to Bill, Mallory's mom and dad died in a fire, and she grew up in foster homes. She'd gone to a minor league university to study management, and now she was looking for a job. Bill knew what he was talking about because Mallory's last guardians had come here every summer for summer vacations. "She's a smart girl, but—" Bill waved his hand. "First she went to those goths. Well, you can tell, then with those." He grimaced, sipping his coffee. "They messed with her head. They almost killed her. I think they lured her in so cleverly." "Who are you talking about?" Harvey asked. The sheriff said it wasn't locals. He stammered, catching himself as he was about to divulge information he shouldn't. "I'm sure they're not from around here," grinned Bill, "but I'm afraid they're not going to be joined by any of us. They're good people, but what if they're rotten?" And then Bill said such things that Harvey forgot about his breakfast, though he was hungry as a wolf. It turned out that Bill was as well, informed as the sheriff, but the information he was willing to share was much more generous. There were rumors that the villains were not just some lunatics, but real sectarians who believed that to prosper and succeed in life, it was enough to make a pact with the forces that dwelt on these and many other lands of America. In general, Harvey had heard this version from Jacob, but in Bill's mouth it acquired a lot of additional details. "What do you know about shifters?" Bill asked, squinting meaningfully, and Harvey felt like a schoolboy who was failing an exam in front of a strict teacher. "They're also called skinwalkers, that is, walking around in their skin." Harvey replied that his knowledge was meager, but he had heard about werewolves when he was a small boy and lived across the sea and had read tales. He had also heard some things about the locals. Our werewolves could even turn into a broom and a stone. He shared what he remembered from a fairy tale. Bill grinned and turned to the topic of education. It turned out that the local American shifters, as they said once, were all humans and witches. They belonged to the Indians, who turned to secret knowledge to drive away the first settlers from the old world, to avenge them for the ruined lives of tribesmen. But then, suddenly the shifters realized black magic was to their liking. Those who practiced it became distorted in their souls and realized that it was possible to inflict evil, not only on strangers, but also on their own, and it's just as much fun. Werewolves attacked livestock, frightened those who dared to go into the forest alone, settled personal scores, could, for example, drive people crazy by appearing in front of them with a malicious laughter, dancing on their hind legs half beast and half man. Over time, shifters in general gave their souls to evil and became inhabitants of the other world rather than ours. However, legend said that knowledgeable people could turn to them through black magic and ask for anything, and ask usually about the worst force to fall in love with a man, to destroy the herd of annoying neighbor, to attract good luck that the competitors ruined. And you rich, how many people believe in that? Harvey marveled. You should go to a place where the natives live sometime. Bill winked. Native Americans, I mean them. There, by the way, young people don't go to all those Hollywood movies about good werewolves, and they don't even mention them out loud. They say that the creatures are able to eavesdrop on conversations about them. True, there are some herbs, and if you have them with you, it's as if the bugging will stop. Do you have them on you? Harvey asked Harvey somehow completely rashly and immediately got angry at himself. What a nonsense, he doesn't believe in all this. I don't want Barry and me to get our heads chewed off someday, Bill wagged his finger at him. Now what are the names of the herbs? You light a bunch of them on fire and walk around. No. Harvey waved his hands in the air. What are you doing? I don't believe in such things at all. Bill said, sipping his coffee meaningfully, and with a touch of, "So I believed you," he said. Then he went on. The old man suggested that those who threw Mallory in the woods were the kind of sorcerers who would have done much worse. They would have done much worse to her, but something had spooked them, and they had completed the ritual prematurely. What could have spooked such scumbags? Harvey grinned. Maybe the thing they were calling for came, and they got cold feet. It's going to be hard on the sheriff. We've got a lot of people coming in for a day or two, and then we're on our way. How do we know which ones? You can't question them all. It's a lot of red tape with neighboring states. And then there's a lot of roads. Maybe they went straight into the woods and didn't come into town. Wait a minute, Harvey had a sudden realization. How could they not find it? Mallory, she was there. She was with them, so she should be able to describe it in no time. But she can't be covering for them. After all, he shared his thoughts confusedly, or do you think she was out to get something too? Well, she's like that. You said it yourself. Maybe she thought she was going to ask for it, but they decided to sacrifice her. Unfortunately, Mallory herself is unlikely to tell anything, sighed Bill. She's completely crazy. She's on tranquilizers now, and she's always babbling about shifters. I'm sure I know someone who works at the clinic. Anyway, even if she stops lurking in corners now, she might not remember who attacked her. I mean, she was twirling her tail in a nightclub. So she found herself an adventure, in a word. So she has some kind of selective amnesia, Harvey clarified. They say it's because of post-traumatic stress disorder, Bill said in a lecturing tone. It happens. Besides, maybe she was drugged with something. Or maybe it's just that this person's nervous system turned out to be so fragile. Who knows what they did to her? I don't think it's anything like that, Harvey coughed awkwardly. Don't think, Bill grinned. Sometimes there are no wounds and nothing like that has been done to a man, but he's been through something like that. Maybe he's seen something like that, maybe he's seen something like that, and that's it. Goodbye, healthy mind. In general, it's a complicated case. Harvey shook his head. The clinic for the mentally ill was in a neighboring town. But if she gets better, they'll let her go, of course, to all four sides. Bill said, perhaps now Mallory will become a bum. Well, or go back to her friends in New York if she has them there, of course. The time flew by and it was well past noon. Having paid the bill for himself, Harvey left the cafe. Nothing reminded him of the storm of yesterday. The sky was clear. Pure clouds floated on it like scraps of cotton candy. Far, far away outside the domain of Forest Harvey, white mountain caps. The street on which the cafe was located ran through the town, and if you looked in one direction or the other, you would see many houses and buildings, mostly of brick or stone, against which maples and other shrubbery trees shone with autumn colors. Harvey had never thought of such things before, but now the thought suddenly came to his mind. And what would he do when the time came to retire? Couldn't he just stay in the woods and sit around? That is, theoretically, it is possible to buy a house somewhere outside the reserves, of course. But even Harvey sometimes, when there was an appropriate, slightly melancholy mood, admitted to himself cozy to live in a small town where everyone knows you, and you know everyone knows you, and you know everyone too. He unbuttoned his jacket, the sun was beating down, and went down the street. Harvey! A beautiful woman's voice called out to him, and he turned around. On the opposite side of the street, Sabrina, a friend, was waving at him, and having waved, cheerfully crossed the road, heading towards him. Harvey sighed, not that he wasn't glad to see her, but Sabrina was 43 years old. She was a widow, and only 2 years ago she had sent her sons to university in Texas. The boys had left. They wanted to become engineers. Sabrina was very good for her age. A lush mop of auburn curls, strands of gray in which she was not ashamed, not going to paint it over. An hourglass figure and a Hollywood smile. Sabrina was dressed as always simple, but somehow it looked feminine in dark blue jeans and a plaid shirt, under which she was wearing a t-shirt. But the legs, cowboy boots. Sabrina's husband, by the way, was a real cowboy, but for the sake of her sweetheart, he threw everything away and moved here, where he worked as a second profession, lumberjack. Harvey sometimes met Sabrina on a friendly basis, went bowling, for example, and sometimes he helped her at home with repairs. Sometimes it seemed to him that she flirts openly, but he somehow did not respond to it. In general, Harvey's personal life all these years was in such a state that it was like crying. It seemed that some otherworldly force in the universe sent him in his younger years exclusively unsuitable women, one just to walk. The other was a hunter for his simple earnings. The other just disgusting character. In general, the novels were brief, parting painful, and at some point Harvey decided to do it at all. Not all people are made for family and marriage, probably that's all. But right now he did not want to seem impolite, and so the conversation began. Harvey once again marveled at how, in small towns, quickly spread rumors, growing moreover absolutely fantastic details. Sabrina asked him how he had fought off a bear. Harvey replied that grizzlies live further into the forest, and that nothing of the sort had happened. I see, Sabrina replied, and Harvey seemed disappointed that she didn't have anything so manly to brag about. He was completely embarrassed. Then Sabrina asked, how about we meet for karaoke on Friday? Harvey replied that there was no way he'd be back in the woods by then, and in the meantime he had to meet a distant relative. You have to bring him over. I'll bake a cherry pie. He almost rolled his eyes as it became clear that now he would have to take Archie to the guest house, where Sabrina would torture them with stories about the architectural history of the town, its history in general, and treat them with pie, of course. And she baked pies like no one else. Sometimes Harvey thought he could fall in love for such skill. Finally, he said that they would definitely come to visit. Sabrina smiled as dazzlingly as ever, called him a darling, and left. Harvey saw her off with a thoughtful look. Still, what a beautiful woman she was. It was a pity that he was not made for relationships at all. Remembering that there was something in the forest cottage that needed fixing, Harvey looked in the hardware store. A new nailer, an old broken one, paint, a few other things. Oh. Excuse me. A stranger bumped into him shoulder to shoulder in the aisle between the shelves. Harvey didn't blame him, though, because the aisle was really narrow. So he just said it was all right, and he gave the stranger a look. It was nothing, just a habit of almost all the inhabitants of small towns to look at strangers out of curiosity. This stranger, Harvey could have sworn, came from a big city, and he was wealthy, with leather shoes on his feet, a watch on his hand, a gleaming watch, the kind of man they say is well-groomed. Well-groomed. And although dressed in jeans, but the jacket on top of the cut and the way it is worn by its owner gives away that this man is used to more of a business style. Why and how did he realize all this? Harvey didn't think. His usual powers of observation worked. That's all. And then they went their separate ways. The stranger, by the way, had a full cart of ropes, plastic ties, axes. But immediately, Harvey put it out of his mind. He was more interested in the composition of foam insulation in the windows of the forest house accumulated cracks. But he ran into the stranger at the checkout counter. He just finished punching out the purchases. He paid in cash. Next to him stood a couple of young girls, high school students. They were giggling. The stranger in a suit had just said something funny. And then he said goodbye, and each girl had a business card in her hands. The girls, still giggling about something of their own, punched a spare tire. Yes, and such things were sold here, and left. Harvey paid for his. Do you know him? Tim asked the salesman and cashier. Nope, replied Harvey. Why? Just curious. New guy in town, Harvey replied, putting everything in a bag and telling himself not to be tempted by a packet of chips from the snack stand. It's just that this guy came to see our sheriff, Tim said. And he's, quiet. Relative, Harvey guessed. Nah, Tim shook his head. Some kind of financial advisor. Why are you asking me if you know who he is? I don't know much. I didn't know Jacob was a millionaire, Harvey joked. They say he and his wife just decided to invest their retirement savings in a profitable way. Lucy wants to move to Florida someday. She says she's tired of our cold weather and wants eternal summer. It can get cold in Florida too, believe me, Harvey objected. Okay, bye. The sun was still shining outside. It was wonderful weather. Except that Harvey's mood was starting to turn bad for some reason. Like something bad was going to happen. Deciding that it must be the lack of sleep that was making his nervous system shaky, he resolutely walked down the street and decided to return to his home. That is, to the forest, and from there to call Archie, to clarify when he was going to arrive. And only when he was going to arrive, and only when he was in his native environment. Harvey completely relaxed. Birds sang. The undergrowth rustled. It was free. It was his world. Entering his cottage, Harvey unloaded his bags and began to prepare, for starters, dinner, during which he once again thought that Sabrina's company for the sake of pie could and should be tolerated. The main thing was not to behave in her presence like a silly boy. After all, they could not have a future anyway. It turned out that Archie could arrive the day after tomorrow, and Harvey said that he would meet the guy he had to hitchhike to the town. Better not, Harvey warned him, and in a few words outlined that in general, places here are safe, even theft is almost no. But what happened in the woods? I'm careful, said Archie. What could happen to me? I took karate. Yeah, said Harvey. He realized that the big forehead cannot change his mind. He's not his father. And in general, Harvey had little idea how fashionable karate theoretically can help against, say, some psycho with a baseball bat, or a guy who used to fight in the streets without any rules since he was a kid. But in this case, One could only hope that his chicken-hunting behavior would not turn out to be something one could later say, "I told you so." On the appointed day, Harvey waited for Archie at the bus station. I looked out for him. There he was. They hugged each other, patted each other on the back, and even though it was the first time they had seen each other in person, not through a webcam chat room, Harvey liked this guy right away. He was about to offer him to throw his things in the apartment and give him a little tour of the city. But then Sabrina's car slowed down sharply and dashingly at high speed near them. She smiled and asked, "Who is this handsome man?" Archie introduced himself modestly and obviously embarrassed, and Harvey grinned. Sabrina knew how to flirt so well that even those boys who were old enough to be her sons would have their hearts racing. Well, he was almost her age, and he was almost her age, and he was almost her age, and he was definitely in a race. And then Sabrina suddenly gave out that she was going to the neighboring city to the clinic, because Mallory decided to discharge, deciding that her delirium has passed and she is not a danger to herself or to others. And what do you have to do with it? Harvey did not understand because Sabrina Mallory was not a relative. But the girl's parents had once rented half a house from Sabrina for a summer vacation. It turned out that Sabrina was a kind soul who didn't want the girl to end up literally on the street. That is, theoretically, Mallory had some cash. She could rent a room and then leave. But Sabrina categorically did not want to leave the poor girl unattended in such a state. Harvey frowned. It was noble, of course, but it was inconsiderate, except that Sabrina, like Archie, had no use for arguments. "Will you come with me?" Sabrina asked. Harvey opened his mouth to refuse, but then he was pushed by Archie, whose eyes were burning with the story. "Let's get together, eh? Let's support the girl. She needs friends now more than ever," said Archie. Harvey sighed. Well, what could he do in this situation? The only thing left to do was to wave goodbye to the calm plans for today. Archie's luggage was thrown into the car and the small company set off on their way. On the road, of course, Archie and Sabrina were not silent, talking, telling each other about themselves. Harvey even became jealous of the way they got together. He should have the same ease of communication, but as soon as he was near Sabrina, he felt like a complete idiot. The building of the clinic from the outside did not seem like an asylum for the insane, in the sense that Harvey gloomily imagined it, but rather resembled a small hotel boarding house. Mallory brought out a girl in a staff uniform and said with a smile that they were just happy that young Miss Spencer finally felt better. Mallory had washed off her black shades of makeup. She was now just wearing jeans and an oversized gray sweatshirt with pink funny kittens on it. Mallory now looked like an ordinary girl, and somehow that made Harvey feel even more sorry for her. Who knows how quickly she would be able to start living normally again after everything. Although youth, they theoretically should have helped. Mallory was surprised that Harvey also came for her, and for a couple of minutes there was an awkward silence between them. Each of them, judging by Harvey's assumptions, remembered that night. The atmosphere was lightened by Archie. He said some stupid joke, then ranted about how nice it was to live in the world. And on the way back, everyone felt much freer. Naturally, there was no chance to refuse Sabrina's tea party, where there was a sweet pie so often remembered by Harvey, this time with cherries and cinnamon. They talked about everything again and even played a game of Monopoly, which Archie won. "You'll be a millionaire," Harvey joked. "Maybe," grinned the boy. "I've got big plans for my life. I think I'm guaranteed success." "It's dangerous to talk like that," Harvey said. "Life is more complicated than it seems, and things don't always go the way you want them to." "Come on," waved the relative away. "The main thing is to know where to look and not be afraid to pay the price for your goals." Mallory shrugged her shoulders and put the hood of her sweater over her head for some reason, then looked at the uncovered window where the full moon was shining in. Harvey didn't know why, but he didn't like the new direction of the conversation and hurried to change it. Sabrina announced that the sheriff was throwing a party on Friday to which many people were already invited, including her and Harvey. "Why me?" he exclaimed in despair, and they laughed at him. Just Harvey could not stand all these parties. Were either noisy and you stagger around lost, not realizing what company to join, or on the contrary, prim and boring, and you feel like a badger who came out of the woods and now hangs out in a different environment. "I'm not going," he said firmly. "Too bad." Sabrina sighed and gave him a half-smile and a look that made my stomach turn. "Then I'll tell Sam that he can be my date for tonight." Sam was a prominent local guy, recently divorced. He ran a veterinarian's office. "Please," practically exclaimed the forester, because he realized he would never make such a mistake as going with Sabrina on his arm to some party. It would be too much. Finally, leaving the ladies to rest, Harvey took Archie back to the apartment and settled down to sleep there himself. In the morning, Harvey was going to pick up his car from the repair shop, then drive into the woods and spend a wonderful, quiet, peaceful 2 days there. One, just him in the woods. What else does a man need to be happy? And then, so he agreed to go to Jacob's party. The party wasn't as bad as Harvey expected. Just a house full of guests, trays of appetizers and drinks on several tables. There were a lot of acquaintances, and Harvey thought he'd be exchanging neighborly pleasantries for a year to come. For what a strange thing it is to be in a crowded society when you are used to the native forest, Jacob's wife Naomi said her traditional joke. "Come on, I'll introduce you to our special guest." Harvey wanted to refuse that he was fine and that he had already seen Jacob, but Naomi took him under her arm and dragged him inevitably, as if a typhoon were dragging a bird. Then she chirped, and Harvey realized with a sort of unpleasant surprise that he was being introduced to the same burly man from the store. But now the type was entirely in a suit and tie, and from his breast pocket he could see a corner of a shapely folded silk handkerchief with a Turkish cucumber pattern. The type smiled broadly and somehow predatory, and said that he and Harvey practically knew each other. He was joking, of course, because they didn't know each other. It turned out that this man named Frederick Rain was the long-awaited financial consultant. He also happens to be a college professor in a neighboring town, and a successful businessman. In short, the whole package. Envy him, but only Harvey near him had a strange feeling was uncomfortable. Wanted to get away, to stop following you, these shrewd brown eyes with golden red sparkles. Young people are the future, right? Naomi said that Frederick not only teaches at his home university, but also acts as a kind of mentor for the student fraternity. Harvey chuckled, staring down at his glass of soft punch, when he heard that some of the local youth, too, had already become imbued with Frederick's charisma. Harvey had been a peaceful man all his life, but here he just wanted to punch him, to wipe off that masked grin. Harvey shrugged his shoulders, shook his head as if shaking off a strange obsession. What was he really doing? Just a man who wasn't likable. It happens, nothing special. To distract himself, he decided to walk around and find his young Archie. He found himself at the table with appetizers, where he was cheerfully eating tartlets with pâté. "How's all this?" Harvey asked. "It's all right," Archie nodded, chewing vigorously. "But I'm thinking." "About what?" "How to get on, my life." "What have you decided?" "I haven't made up my mind yet." "You're not thinking of going home?" "There's your mother and father there. You moved away and never came back," grinned Archie. "I'm different," Harvey said calmly and seriously, "and I'll leave you to it." "Have fun. Where's Mallory?" "I have no idea." Archie was now interested in fruit jelly and had a bowl full of colorful candy. The unobtrusive melodies of jazz and the scattered voices of the guests were suddenly cut by a piercing scream. Mallory was frozen in the middle of the hall. The girl pressed her palms to her face and screamed, looking at the window in front of her, where Frederick Rain was standing with a most shocked look. "A wolf! A wolf!" cried Mallory. "My girl." Sabrina, who was filled with sincere, fervent anxiety, rushed to her. "What are you talking about?" "What wolf?" There, mumbled Mallory, stammering and gasping for air. Some of the guests were leaning against the window looking out. What's out there? Naomi had said they didn't even have a dog, and even though the property wasn't fenced, it was unlikely that there would be any. In fact, with a friendly and yet snide smile, Frederick turned to Harvey, confirmed that there are no wolves in this area. You are a forester, aren't you? And surely you must be well aware of everything that goes on. So to speak in your domain, there are no wolves, Harvey said. He felt very sorry for Mallory, who was now shaking and looking around with round, crazy eyes. Wolf, she whispered. And then, covering her face with her hands, she sobbed. Long, desperate sobs that lost all hope of understanding from those around her. Poor thing, said one of the guests. Are they going to lock her up again? Archie asked. No way, said Sabrina. The poor thing's just overworked. It must have been a little dog that wandered in. Tell you what. Let me take you home, okay? You need to get some sleep. Will you walk me home? Harvey asked his relative. He was about to leave, but he didn't want to leave Archie here. No, I'm staying, he answered. Frederick promised to tell me something interesting. You should listen to him less, Harvey said. Why? I don't like him. Oh, don't take offense, he smiled and gave Frederick, still standing by the window with a glass in his hand, a look of admiration. But you've gone wild, you woodsman. I'm sorry, but I'm staying. Maybe tonight. In particular, I'll have a chance to make some useful acquaintance that will turn my life around. What could Harvey do? Only say goodbye to his hosts, wish them and their guests a pleasant evening, and leave. Fortunately, it was now possible to return to his car, and the road seemed quite fast. By the time he reached it, it was deep night. The moon was peeking out of the clouds, then hiding behind them again. Harvey unlocked the door of the gatehouse and was about to go inside when suddenly something caught his attention. He ran his palm along the jamb, rubbed his fingers together, and there was stripped wood. Thin, long strips, as if a huge beast had sharpened its claws here. And when he closed the door on his way out, it hadn't been. Harvey was sure he would have noticed it. He turned around abruptly just because he felt like it. The forest was silent, majestic, dark, deaf to the anxieties of human civilization. It was a different world out here, and though Harvey had been his faithful guardian for a year now, it was now that he suddenly felt his loneliness to the fullest for so many kilometers without a soul, and he felt vulnerable. Hurriedly entered, even ran into the cabin and locked the door. He sighed and hastily built a fire in the stove. Let the flame shine. Let it chase away the unfriendly darkness and unnecessary thoughts. The next few days passed in relative peace. Harvey did his forestry work and did not go to town. But then he had to. First, agreed to meet Archie, promised to show his relative the local sights. Secondly, he decided to stop by Sabrina's and ask about Mallory's health. Harvey had no doubt that the girl should start seeing a psychiatrist. Archie, whom they met at the diner, which was a favorite with the old-timers of the town, was unusually enthusiastic and was bursting with news. It turned out that Frederick Rain had already taken him to a neighboring town, where he introduced him to talented students from that closed fraternity and told him that there were several unique programs of personal growth, including also trainings for people who want to take care of their successful future. And all this, of course, not for free. Harvey grinned and rubbed his fingers together, hinting that the young and green relative would now just be used to pull money out of him. And not at all. Archie was offended. Offended that his mentor Frederick so disrespectful talk. Contributions are voluntary. No one is forced. We choose our own path. He says he can help build a career and introduce us to the right people with connections. Why don't you just go home? You got your education here, and your mother told me that your uncle has a business there and invites you to join it? Comparison. Archie curled his lips. A small business selling plastic containers, and we're talking about really big money here. You can build a future for yourself that... All right. Enough of this, I guess. Harvey slammed his palm down on the table. For some reason, he was sick of talking about all this, and Frederick's subservient mentions were like a bone in his throat. The conversation turned to another direction. It turned out that Sabrina had bothered to find a good rehabilitation clinic for Mallory in a neighboring state, and the girl could be accepted there even with insurance. After the incident at the party, it became clear that Mallory was getting worse. She was afraid to sleep without light and kept repeating that he would come for her. And there was no hope that her memory would come back to her in such a state. "You should go and see her off," said Harvey. "Why?" Archie frowned. "No, I understand. She's a pretty girl. Young, and I feel sorry for her. But no. She's not my type. I don't mean romance at all." Harvey shook his head reproachfully. "I'm talking about humanely helping. Altruism and compassion." Archie grinned. "It's never too late to add them, you know." "Well, as far as I'm concerned," said the boy. "So it's not always useful or even necessary in the modern world. Frederick says that all of us, I mean people, are like animals, and you just have to decide who you are by nature." "Well, then I'll go with them." "I can take a couple of days of vacation at my own expense," Harvey said thoughtfully. "Is it because you want to be a knight for Sabrina?" Archie waggled his eyebrows meaningfully. "What?" Harvey was sweating in a flash. "It was nothing like that." "Oh, come on. I can see the way you look at her. We're just old acquaintances. All the better. Less chance of you getting divorced." "Shut up." "There. All the signs are there. You've fallen in love in your old age. Well, I've got to go." After throwing a few bills on the table for his part of the order, Archie stood up and smiled broadly. It felt like life was about to take a turn for the worse. The main thing is not to be upside down and not to fall down painfully. "Goodbye, old pessimist," laughed the relative, and almost jumped up and down as he left the diner. Harvey finished his coffee in depressed thoughtfulness. Yes, he decided he would definitely go. Maybe an easy trip and a change of scenery was just what he needed right now. Sabrina liked the idea of accompanying him, and on the appointed day, they all got into the car. "I've made a playlist." Sabrina smiled. "For good mood and stress, minimizing tunes. This is unusual music based on ancient Celtic tunes." Harvey rolled his eyes because, well, what the heck is this nonsense? But then he waved his hand. If women want such fancy things on a trip, they're welcome to them. The way was not a long way. Harvey had not been so far away for a long time, and at first he even felt some tension when the town that had become his native town melted away. But then he was distracted by the scenery around her. We had a snack in roadside cafes, and it turned out that Sabrina had thoroughly prepared about all of them, studied reviews. So it was possible not to be afraid of stomach problems, and could surely order the most delicious. 2 roadside motels had been chosen in advance for overnight stays too, from those that rented tiny to Archie 1 room with a bathroom. The first night was quiet, calm, and even funny. They watched some late-night show, competing with its participants in correct answers, and ate pizza. Then separated, for the ladies had a separate room, and for Harvey his own. By the evening of the second day, Sabrina was yawning widely. "Let me drive," Harvey said. "You haven't slept well." "It's nothing," she said. "It was just a nightmare." "Yeah. What was it?" Harvey glanced at us, Mallory girl half sitting, half lying on the back seat, and slept, covered with a fluffy, soft plaid gift from Sabrina. "Nonsense," Sabrina laughed, but her laugh sounded fake, that the shifters are watching us. Watching our every move, and they want to. Attack. I saw a wolf with eyes burning with hellfire. He was their leader. "Yeah," Harvey said. It seemed to him suddenly terribly cozy, the idea that there was only a little way to go down this very road, narrow and old and old and old and old and almost abandoned. That they had decided to take a shortcut, that there was only a little way to go, and there would be a motel, where they would spend the night, and tomorrow, by 6 o'clock in the afternoon, they would be at their destination. Harvey had been so dreaming of rest that he had almost dozed off, and so he jumped up in shock, his head banging as Sabrina suddenly slammed on the brakes. "What? What happened?" he asked, looking around. Up ahead, blocking the road, were two SUVs. One was more powerful, with additional headlights mounted on it, and the way the car stood did not look like the aftermath of an accident. It was clear that they had been put there on purpose. There were 6 people standing near the cars. 7 to be exact. Just one of them stood out in particular. The headlights from Sabrina's car cut out the figures of people like grotesque illustrations of some terrible picture. And then one of those people separated from the others and approached. He bent down and knocked on the driver's side window, smiled, and gestured that he would open it. It was Frederick Rain. "What are you standing there for?" Harvey exclaimed. "Step on the gas. Turn around. Let's go." "What's going on?" Sabrina looked confused. She looked from Harvey to the man outside the window. She was clearly confused. She had just been driving along the road calmly, and suddenly, at the next turn, it turned out that it was necessary to slow down. Those who blocked the way appeared out of nowhere. Harvey couldn't say what was wrong in this situation, but he just knew that the time to get away, to escape, it was running out like grains of sand from a split hourglass. It was becoming less and less. Stop. There was no more left. Sabrina had behaved, Harvey thought, like a complete fool in a horror movie character, ignoring the obvious danger, thinking there was something strange but not deadly. And then everything happened very quickly. Frederick's hand burst into the open window, grabbed Sabrina by the hair and sharply hit her head against the glass, then opened the car door from inside. From the back seat came the squealing and clinking of glass. Waking up Mallory was hysterical, and one of Frederick's men smashed the window with the butt of a gun. Harvey. He knew what to do in this situation, in theory, of course, fight. But first the seat belt got stuck, which of course was bad for maneuverability, and then they got to him. Harvey knew that he was in principle a strong man, not weak, but what could he do against 3 opponents at once? He was hit on the head with the same buttstock, and now his eyes were dancing with red sparks, ringing in the back of his head. Perfect. Everything is going exactly as I planned, Frederick told his captives in a tone as if they were business meetings from his diary. What? What do you want, Frederick? What do you... Sabrina looked around in a panic, clearly unable to believe what was happening. Harvey was sniffling silently. He was on the fragile edge of trying to figure out what was going on here, whether to rush into the fight, hoping for some random luck, or join Mallory, who was hysterical. Almost silently, though, because the girl was gagged. You see, sometimes every person, and especially those who do not intend to lead a miserable, mediocre existence, must overcome, pass a certain stage, which, say, Frederick spoke in a lecturing tone, and it seemed that he was not just explaining to his captives the essence of what was happening, but was showing off to himself, which would lead him to a new path. I and my students are on it. And you have been chosen to join us. In a way, are you crazy, man? Harvey asked, because there was no other way to phrase the question. Tomorrow, Frederick said, the tracks of your car will be found on this road. Then it will be found in the swamp. And then your remains will probably be found one day. No, please. What are you saying? It's not. What do you want? Look, you have to let us go. You can't get away with this. Shut her up, Frederick threw to his men, and a moment later Sabrina was silenced, her mouth gagged as well. Harvey assessed the men in front of him, all young, no older than 25, and for some reason they were all wearing T-shirts with the same symbols. And then a hunch pierced his brain. A fraternity. Frederick, what the... We didn't agree to this. One of the guys stepped into the spotlight, and Harvey was splashed with ice water. It was Archie. I didn't sign up for this. You said we'd... I said that if you were so eager you could join us. And tonight, The night of our meeting. Prove your dedication to our common cause, replied Frederick with a gracious smile. What's the matter, boy? You ranted the most at the fraternity meeting. You were so passionately listening to the exploits of the past. I thought, what are these legends? Whispered Archie, you must let them go. Oh, that's how you talk. Frederick waved his hand, and one of the boys, the tallest and baldest, came up and kicked Archie in the stomach. He groaned and gasped and fell to his knees in front of Frederick. Why did we even get him? Exclaimed one of the boys. He's a loser. Frederick, coming up to the man who had spoken, gave him a short, whip-like slap on the face, and then held out his hand, and the lad took it and pressed his lips to the ringed fingers, which left scarlet streaks on his face. He's our clan brother, and whatever he is one of us. Show respect. Forgive me, master. You are forgiven, Frederick said. He returned his attention to his captives. Shoving his hands into the pockets of his strange black robe, he smiled broadly and welcomingly, even at them, as if he were ready to tell them $1 million secret. And then he spoke. It turned out that the guys who had come with Frederick were college kids. Young blood, as he put it. In general, Archie was not originally planned to be accepted so quickly into the general ranks, and even more so to initiate into some of the nuances of this secret brotherhood. But the guy seemed to Frederick promising. And besides the fact that he was a distant relative of Harvey, he saw a sign. Frederick said that yes, what happened to Mallory in the woods was their work. They did perform the ritual, but something went wrong, and those who walk the paths of shadows between the worlds were not satisfied with the sacrifice. That rarely happened. Anyway, the ritual had to be hastily completed. They didn't think Mallory would survive, but then Harvey appeared. He saved her, and Frederick saw this as a special sign to indicate that those who send mercy on their faithful servants, were ready to accept the sacrifice again. They still need such a fresh, naive, lost among the many roads of life, and that is why Frederick was choosing the right moment to take her. And then he received a sign and realized this time the sacrifice should be more abundant, much more than before. But the reward would be such that all the members of the Brotherhood would receive something they had never dreamed of. But that's nonsense. You know, Harvey exclaimed. One lunatic has gathered a bunch of idiots around him. Do you think these are all my men? Frederick spread his arms and looked triumphantly around his minions. No, you fool. In fact, it's only a small fraction. And those who, thanks to me and the ancient knowledge that I inherited from my ancestors, have come to wealth, fame, and prosperity, much more. You have no idea what serious people are behind me. Frederick leaned quite low. Harvey could feel his fresh, and at the same time some unnaturally sweet breath on his face. And it was so disgusting. You have no idea, Frederick finished in a confidential whisper, what kind of men stand above me, and who are ready to clean up the dirt that unfortunately sometimes remains, and who shut the mouths of those who seek the truth too zealously. This truth, this ancient knowledge, not everyone can understand it. A psychopath and a freak, Harvey gritted his teeth, and then, without restraint, spat directly into Frederick's polished face. He recoiled, ran his palm over his cheek, looked at the moisture on it disbelievingly. Then he turned a shocked look at Harvey, and Harvey realized that this type did not expect such a thing. It seemed to be a trifle. He hadn't done any damage except morale. But he felt so much better. He nodded at Archie, who was still on his knees, and judging by the way his shoulders were shaking, he was ready to cry like a boy. The same thing they all want, grinned Frederick. Wealth, fame, the love of beautiful women, money, success, health, happiness, the complete package, right? But unfortunately, not everyone. Not everyone is willing to pay. Some people think what I'm talking about are metaphors. Some think shifters. They're just fairy tales from their great-grandfathers. They think we're gonna do a black magic ritual as a joke, and then the gifts of this world will rain down on them. Idiots! Cretins! The enraged Frederick turned to shouting. He practically squealed. And then, when they realize that it's serious and that those we serve want really serious offering, well, everyone behaves differently. Those who are really worth something go all the way, and they get everything they dreamed of. And those who are weak, then they don't even deserve to live. Listen to me, I beg you. Listen to me. Sabrina had managed to spit the gag out of her mouth and was now addressing a handful of lunatics who, in Harvey's opinion, were incapable of understanding anything. You're making a mistake, Sabrina's voice, despite the shock, sounded firm. If you let us go, then you promise not to tell anyone anything. Frederick finished her sentence snidely. But you realize, dear miss, that these are empty words, don't you? You do realize that even if I were to feel, stupid pity now, I couldn't let you go without jeopardizing our common cause, could I? Sabrina, like the other captives, was brought to her knees. Frederick, approaching, squatted down in front of her and firmly grasped her chin, forcing her to look directly into his eyes. I confess I acted a little impulsively this time. I usually plan everything carefully in advance. But what a bore, always following the rules, even if you made them up yourself, right? Don't worry. It'll be over pretty quickly. Really, Frederick stood up. I can't promise you won't feel anything. They're hungry. This is crazy, Sabrina sobbed. We haven't done anything to you. You think you can only get into trouble if you've crossed the bad guys, as they say. Frederick waved his hands. I have to disappoint you, but you, Sabrina, were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. Yes, so banal. But still try to look at it from the other side. You could have been the victim of some ordinary maniac. Well, purely theoretically, and so you have time to get acquainted with those whose existence in the world, unfortunately, still deny. Damn you, Harvey roared. You think you're tough. You think you're all tough. He glared at the minions of the stately madman, big men who want to sacrifice a girl. Not a penny of conscience. You think this is going to do anything for you? You know, I'm getting tired of talking, Frederick said, raising his face to the sky, where the clouds were just parting to reveal the moon. In general, I don't usually like to talk so long. I'm sorry. It reminds me of the end of some cheap thriller. You know, the kind where the main character stalls for time, learning from the main villain about all his devious plans. And then Frederick sighed and grinned, snapped his fingers, and at his commanding gesture, the captives were hauled to their feet. 3 men, 1 for each. The other guys, including Archie, who had finally risen, just stood a few paces away and watched, being, in fact, sort of like backup guards, for the objects of future sacrifice. And then, as you know, in the final, when it seems that there is nothing more for the heroes to hope for, suddenly there is an unexpected opportunity to save themselves. And then they lived happily ever after. Oh, what can I say? I grew up on such movies myself. But it should be recognized Frederick, for a moment, went to one of the 2 cars, and when he came back, began to pull on his hands' gloves without haste. And on his belt he had a weapon, a knife, however more like a sword, with which you could fight off a dinosaur. It is worth admitting, he finished in a lazy and relaxed tone, that in life everything is not like that. In life everything is simpler. There are sheep and there are wolves. If you're just people, then we're the elite. So, Archie, he turned to the boy, if you'd like to apologize or say something sentimental. Now is the only opportunity. Avi could have sworn that everything that was happening was a bad dream, a nightmare vision, and at the same time he realized it was all reality. He could hear Mallory moaning softly. He could hear Sabrina crying and begging for mercy. He could see that in the eyes of the young men gathered there was not an ounce of pity, that they believed their leader, that he could summon fantastical werewolves and sacrifice them to get them. The green idiots, all kinds of earthly benefits. Harvey didn't resist as he was roughly hauled to his feet and pushed forward, forced to walk 100 feet from the road to the forest, which was where everyone was going. And it was none other than Archie who was leading him. For some reason, Harvey was most offended by the fact that this kid had gotten into such a mess. Or maybe he'd already woken up, realized where he'd gotten himself into. But what can he do? Trust me, Archie's voice sounded at his ear, as if in answer to his confused thoughts. Just trust me, I'm not with them. Harvey shrugged his shoulders and grimaced at the sharp pain in his plastic-strapped wrists. Frederick was clearly a madman, but he also clearly knew how to make sure that his ritual victims didn't get away by happy accident. Harvey had known before that every forest was unique, and every forest was unique, and every forest was the only one of its kind in the world. The one under whose canopy they stepped now consisted mostly of hardwoods. Here, unlike the places the forester had known for years, there were more tall grasses in the undergrowth, as well as bumps and twigs. The whole creepy procession was not moving along paths, but literally through the bushes. But it seemed that Frederick knew where to go. He moved almost silently, and then suddenly they came, as if they had fallen out, into a clearing. It was even smaller than the one where Harvey had found Mallory. And then Harvey, though it was obviously not the right time, thought that it was all a foolish thing that had happened. He was living his life, not touching anyone. And here it was, and how much he had not yet had time. "Sabrina," he called out to her, and then, catching the woman's gaze, continued, "If we get out, will you marry me?" It wasn't just a question, it was a desperate call. Harvey, for the first time, made out his feelings and how much he didn't care in a sense about what was going on. Somehow it seemed to him that the most important thing was her consent, and then, let it be anything. Sabrina looked at him like he was crazy, and he didn't blame her because it was the worst possible moment. But then she nodded. "What a touching scene," Frederick said. He stopped in the middle of the clearing and looked around. "It's a pity it's all useless chatter." He knelt down and began to draw on the ground with the point of his knife. Harvey guessed it was an attempt to make sorcerous signs. Though Harvey didn't believe in it at all, he could have sworn on anything that Frederick was doing a disgusting job, and that no one would come to him, and if he did, he would be angry at such a disrespectful attitude. In general, all sorts of thoughts, and even a little silly, were going through his head. And then, he didn't have time for thoughts, because Frederick suddenly pointed the blade glinting in the moonlight at Harvey. At first but the woodsman somehow missed it. He knew the forest very well, and now realized something was watching them from the thicket. Someone was there, very close. It was a strange sensation. You don't see how, say, the bushes move when the beast moves, but you feel its gaze. And the next moment, two things happened. First, the moon finally came out from behind the clouds, and its pale, ghostly light illuminated the clearing. Second, the bushes from behind which someone was looking finally parted, and a wolf stepped into the clearing. And what a wolf it was! It took Harvey's breath away. A tall, sturdy beauty of unusual gray-silver color. His eyes shone and his lips were raised, revealing fangs. It would be natural to think that wolves can be large, and fear, as we know, has great eyes. But this wolf, he seemed to be the size of a calf. Everyone who saw it froze. The sectarians froze who was in what pose. But Frederick was unlucky enough to be closest to the beast. He looked at it, and Harvey knew there was nothing of the joy of meeting this creature, the true master of the forest. "Master," squeaked one of the boys. "Is that him?" "A shifter. They heard us. We'll be rich?" "Shut up, you idiot." "Cut him short," Frederick cut him off with a colorless voice. And then, he did what every forester knew should never be done. He turned his back to the predator and ran. One moment and the powerful sect leader was hidden in the black thickness of the forest. "Ouch," said another guy. The wolf tilted his head to the side as if wondering what he should do now. And then in one powerful leap, almost flying, overcame the distance to the trees and disappeared among them. "Run!" shouted the remaining sectarians. And at the same moment the forest was filled with the crunch of broken branches underfoot, curses and screams. The guys were running away, except for one. Archie froze. He looked as if everything that had happened was somehow offensive to him. At any rate, that was how Harvey had interpreted his look. Though what was there to interpret when you were looking at a man's face in the false, ghostly moonlight? "It's all right," suddenly exclaimed Archie. And then he threw himself and the fetters fell from Harvey's hands. Then he rushed to Sabrina and Mallory freed them. And at the same time the boy was talking. And he was saying things that Harvey just couldn't get out of his head. "You're lying," he simply retorted, just to save your own skin by realizing that your madness had failed. What are your parents going to do? You thought about them, you disgrace to your own kind?" Harvey stopped talking to catch his breath, and then he heard a new sound of police sirens wailing, which were gradually getting closer. "What's going on?" Sabrina asked. Mallory would probably have wondered what was going on. But now the poor thing was unconscious again and had just collapsed where she stood, and would probably have broken something in the fall if Archie hadn't supported her. "I told you so," he said, laying the girl's head gently on his own jacket, which had been thrown on the ground. "I told you so," and Harvey realized how wrong he had been. Archie was neither a sectarian nor a violent man. It was quite the opposite. It turned out that sometime before he came to visit Harvey, he had been contacted by the police and another organization specializing in combating dangerous cults. And they said that Archie, if he wanted, of course, could seriously help in the investigation, because he was a relative of Harvey, in the woodlands of which supposedly and should have appeared violent sectarians. Archie suggested to do two things. First, to look at Harvey, because you see the authorities first suspected him, thought that he also joined the sect and intends to supply them with young girls for sacrifice. Archie's second task was to infiltrate the sectarians. However, since he was neither a special agent nor a policeman, it was assumed at first that he would simply interest Frederick, try to find out something from him. But suddenly Archie decided to play a big game, and only when he succeeded did he inform those who supported him in this most dangerous game. He was offered to leave. It was all too dangerous, but Archie said that he would stay to investigate everything alone. And then everything went a little bit wrong. Everyone thought that Frederick was planning to take Mallory away from the rehabilitation clinic, presenting himself as a psychiatrist under whose care the poor girl had been taken. But then it turned out that he had decided to perform the rite earlier. The plans had to be urgently corrected. Archie barely had time to report that the cult leader had already kidnapped 3 people. The police was sent from the nearest town to the coordinates transmitted by the bug hidden on Archie's body. Archie, of course, could not give himself away, but whispered a few words to Harvey. He was afraid that everything would be very bad and was going to attack Frederick at all, to provoke a fuss, to buy a little needed time. But then the wolf appeared. Later, when they got out of the forest, or rather, the whole little company was brought to the city, Archie asked his relative what this beast was doing here. "So there are wolves after all?" Harvey answered that for many decades there are no wolves. But this one, probably a loner from somewhere, wandered. Mallory was immediately taken to the clinic. But the doctors the next day reported that although she will have to spend a lot of time there to collect what they call broken consciousness, but hope for the best, because the girl began to return some memories. Sabrina was not hurt. Only her wrists were wiped off. Harvey was also unharmed. It turned out that all the sectarians were caught the same night. But Frederick, his traces were lost in the depths of the forest. Search teams, which had helicopters and well-trained dogs, returned without results. Frederick's traces disappeared, where the forest became quite impassable and where the swamps began. If I believed in all this, I'd say he was taken by those shifters, the wicked sorcerers, that they'd had enough of him. Harvey's opinion when Archie told him the latest news. The boy also said that he was going to return home and decided that he would build his career and a better life not in America, but in his hometown. That's right, sighed Harvey. But I'll stay here. Where will I go now? I've been here so many years. You're needed here, said Archie. Who else can help with the woods like you can? How's Jacob, by the way? Shocked, Harvey said, and even wanted to resign as sheriff. You'd think he'd fallen for a nut like that. But our local townspeople wouldn't let him. He's a good man. Anyway, shocked and sad, but he's working. What about you? Don't start, eh? Harvey interrupted his relative and even turned away to stare out of the window. They met at the same diner. But you like her. Admit it, grinned Archie, and then, it's just that we were all scared. Listen, it's not for me to teach you, but I'll tell you, Archie began cautiously. You've spent half your life alone. And where did you come to? No, a favorite job, a vocation, that's all well and good. But wouldn't you like to be a family man yourself? And such a chance. You know, if I were a couple decades older, or if Sabrina were younger, I'd show you what to do when you meet the right woman. Archie said a lot of other things. And Harvey listened to it all. He thought about it himself. He had to be consistent. In fact, Sabrina hadn't said a word about what they'd said in the forest. They'd been communicating in a purely friendly way since they'd been rescued, just like before. But he realized she remembered everything perfectly well, and he also supposed that Sabrina might have taken his impulse as a sign of weakness and didn't want to talk about it so that he wouldn't hurt her. Only right now Harvey was determined they would talk about it, tonight and now. He called for the waitress, asked and paid the bill, treating Archie. Then he wished him a good evening. The guy was flying home in 2 months and planned to stay in town for a while, and then to travel around the country. When he went outside, Harvey took a deep breath. The air was clean, fresh, and smelled of near autumn. He decided that he would go to Sabrina right now. But first he would go to the flower store for a bouquet of pink hyacinths. They were her favorite flowers. And also to the jewelry store for a ring with a small diamond. And he would propose again, but now in a romantic way. And Harvey's intuition told him that everything would be fine with Sabrina, that they would have a quiet, calm family happiness for two. Thank you for watching this video to the end. Subscribe to the channel. Like it, write comments if you like the story, and see you on the channel.